Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 50th meeting of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage in this 39th Parliament. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, a full investigation of the role of a public broadcaster in the 21st century. And this morning, for our first set of witnesses, we have the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, and we welcome you here this morning. Mr. Ronald Cohen, the National Chair, if you would please make your presentation and introduce the rest of your entourage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, honourable members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. My name, as the Chair said, is Ronald Cohen. I'm the National Chair, as he said, and with me are John McNabb, who is the Executive Director of the CBSC, Tisha Gaylard, who is our Director of Policy, and Burhan Warsami, who is the Manager of the CBSC's Ethno-Cultural Outreach Project. While we appreciate the invitation to appear before you, we're acutely aware of the fact that the CBSC's role is in the area of private broadcasting, and your investigation, of course, focuses on the role of the public broadcaster. Our members are Canada's private broadcasters, 609 of them, covering conventional television, specialty services, AM and FM radio, and satellite radio. Effectively, probably 95% of the commercial private broadcasters who are eligible to join the Council. Although it does not fall within our mandate to comment directly on issues involving public broadcasters, what the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council does is so unique and central to the Canadian broadcasting system that you may find elements of what we accomplish at least indirectly worthy of consideration in your deliberations. There are two major aspects of our work that are unique, and you may conclude worthy of replication in the public broadcasting area. The first is the breadth of public concerns to which we are responsive. The second is the extent of our outreach into all Canadian communities. Le Conseil a comme mandat
The Council's mandate is to oversee the administration of the Canadian Private Broadcasters Code. Amongst those, we have the CAB Sex Role Portrayal Code and the CAB Violence Code. All of the CAB codes and all of those that are imposed by the CRTC as license conditions to Canadian broadcasters. Let us not forget the CAB's Code of Ethics and the Radio and Television News Directors Association of Canada's Code of Journalistic Ethics.
The CRTC last week issued a public notice calling for comment on a new CBSC code, the Journalistic Independence Code. It will also be administered by the CBSC and will be a CRTC condition of license on Canadian broadcasters with ownership interests in both print and broadcast areas. And there is another code, the Equitable Portrayal Code, in the offing. It will, in due course, extend to all communities the benefits hitherto available on the basis of gender alone under the terms of the Sex Role Portrayal Code. It should be the subject of another CRTC public notice this year. It's essential to note that the codified standards reflect Canadian values. The enforcement tools are also Canadian. That is to say, effective without being heavy-handed, and industry rather than government-driven. This is particularly pertinent as we have watched the unraveling of the Don Imus debacle in the United States in the past couple of weeks. The concerns of the American regulatory system are limited to nudity and coarse language, not violence on television, not human rights, not portrayal issues, not respect for the dignity of individuals on the basis of their race, ethnic origin, color, sexual orientation, religion, and so on. Those are Canadian values and central to our standards and enforcement system. Canada does not depend on advertisers to force program change on an ad hoc basis as in the United States. We have rules that broadcasters willingly accept. In the exercise of our mandate, the CBSC has, since 1991, received complaints from tens of thousands of Canadians about all forms of programming, whether in the news and public affairs area, drama, comedy, talk radio or television, reality programming, entertainment, news magazine shows, feature films, reality programming, children's programming, and so on. Le CCNR a une connaissance assez complète.
We have a very comprehensive understanding of the subjects of the complaints. The CBSC deals with approximately 2,000 complaints from Canadians every year, and we forward these to the CRTC. A number of these concern the CBC.
Of these complaints concern the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Ironically, since the CBC does not have an equivalent system of our own, we forward these to the CRTC to deal with. In fact, having just mentioned the subjects of children's programming on the one hand and audience complaints about many subjects on the other, I note that later today, but as you all know, now delayed until tomorrow, you will be debating Private Members Bill C-327, proposed by the member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie on the subject of violence in the media. Il est donc important que vous...
You should be aware, first of all, that as a percentage of complaints, those relating to violence on television have been steadily declining by a huge margin these last 2 years, between, namely, 37% between 2001 and 2006. Moreover, the Bigra Bill's proposals would add nothing to the panoply of tools we have to deal with the subject, since issues relating to violence on television are already thoroughly covered by the combination of the CAB Violence Code and the Code of Ethics, and rigorously enforced by the self-regulatory system solidly entrenched in the Canadian broadcasting system.
That is not even limited to violence intended for adults. It restricts violence, to be sure, but all forms of adult content to the post-9 p.m. period. We already have provisions for ratings and viewer advisories, which also apply well beyond the violence on television area. We already also have the most detailed provisions to protect children from inappropriate television programming that you can find anywhere in the world. Bill C-327 would, if passed, deliver less to the Canadian public than we already have. Our process encourages the resolution of complaints by meaningful broadcaster dialogue with the complainants. And when this does not lead to complainant satisfaction, The CBSC rules on those complaints via adjudicating panels made up of equal numbers of public and industry adjudicators. There are 5 regional panels: the Atlantic region, Quebec, Ontario, the Prairies, and British Columbia, and 2 national panels, one dealing with conventional television and the other with specialty services. Biographies of every adjudicator, public and industry, are available on the CBSC website. They include former members of Parliament, cabinet ministers, a lieutenant governor, a provincial premier, CRTC commissioners, and Canadians of many walks of life who have manifested their concern about the public good. The private broadcaster's self-regulatory process is predicated on full disclosure and the publicity of all formal CBSC decisions, whether rendered for or against broadcasters. Consequently, the press release announcing every decision is forwarded to the print media, to broadcasters, and any person in Canada or elsewhere in the world wishing to be on the recipient list. The nearly 400 decisions rendered since 1991 are, with their full written reasons, posted on our website. They form an extensive and thorough body of jurisprudence dealing with and defining for the future the widest possible range of content issues. We deal with all forms of content in all kinds of radio and television programming, period. And we do this in an independent, arm's-length fashion with considerable public involvement in our deliberations and decisions. With the exception of the CBC's ombudsman, who work in the narrower area of news and public affairs, Canada's public broadcasters have no equivalent process. The Council is also proud that it reaches out into all corners of Canada's great multicultural environment by informing citizens of Canada's broadcast standards and the self-regulatory system in English, French, and 40 other languages, both in print and on the CBSC website. 2 sets of all of these foreign language versions of the brochure have been deposited with the clerk, and certainly any of you who wish to have a set for yourselves, we will be delighted to provide it and or any individual language that may be of interest to you or indeed to constituents. And I should have added earlier that our adjudicating panels reflect that diversity as well. It is also worth noting that 13.9 million Canadians, not out of the last census, the results of which are just available, but from a couple of years ago, speak one or more of the 40 languages, and that there are programs broadcast in all of these languages in Canada. The 40 languages of comfort reflect Canada's Latin American hemispheric communities, Canada's Indigenous communities in Inuktitut, Inuinnaqtun, Cree, Ojibwe, and Mohawk, Canada's Eastern and Western European communities, Canada's African communities, Canada's Near Eastern communities, Canada's Far Eastern communities, and Canada's South Asian communities in Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Gujarati, Bengali, Tamil, and Sinhala. The CBSC works very hard to ensure that the results of its decisions are known to all who are affected by them. Its volunteer adjudicators on both the public and industry side are dedicated to the emergence of a set of principles that will fairly circumscribe public expectations. It is a mark of the thoughtfulness and impartiality of the adjudicators, both public and industry, that all but 5 of the 398 decisions have been rendered unanimously, whether for or against broadcasters. It is a mark of the success of the Canadian private broadcasters' self-regulatory system that it does not require the huge financial penalties of the American regulatory process to work. The system works because the private broadcasters have committed themselves to the process. They created it. They support it financially. More important, they support it morally. After all, they live in the communities in which they broadcast. They want us to deal with all substantive public concerns about content, not just some of them. And they want us to tell all Canadians in their languages of comfort how to assess the self-regulatory process. It makes good sense, good Canadian sense, good for every corner of the Canadian broadcasting system. Merci de votre temps et de votre...
Thank you for your time and attention. We are available to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn for questions. Ms. Keeper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for your presentation. It is, part of our work is to, to assess how is it that we're serving Canadians, and certainly within the Broadcast Act, we see that over and over again, as you'd mentioned in your presentation, which is, we're talking about Canadian values, and I think that that's what's at the core here, and when you talk about codified standards to reflect Canadian values, I think that is that's critical because one of the things we've heard over and over again throughout this. Our series of hearings is that we're up against the big American television programming, and how is it that we continue to move forward to ensure that we keep the integrity of our Canadian television programming. And so I'd like to ask you about your role, I guess. You'd mentioned it within your presentation, in terms of the CBC, because you said that, you receive complaints and that you forward them to the CRTC. Could I just ask you to clarify a bit more about that, or how is it that you might see the organization serving CBC and its mandate in a stronger role?
Excellent question, of course, Ms. Keeper, a difficult one in some respects to respond to. Basically, we began as a creature of the private broadcasters. It began in 1986, and with the idea that we might go forward in 1988, it began to take some form, and by 1990 we had shape, but the shape basically was a shape created and proposed by the private broadcasters. So at that time, and ever since that time, the private broadcasters have put a lot of resources and support and effort into ensuring that the system would be as effective as they could possibly make it. The CBC had no involvement with it from even the earliest days, and I think it's fair to say that they have their own system, which to some extent must be confusing for the public. After all, if we at the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council are receiving complaints about the CBC, we of course don't expect that the public knows to make a distinction. If it's this station, send a complaint there. If it's that station, send a complaint here. We don't expect them to know what to do, but nonetheless the system that we have at the moment does reflect that distinction between the two. So we don't have much choice, really. We send those complaints when we get them along to the CRTC, which has the responsibility for dealing with any complaints relating to the CBC.
Can I ask you about, you talk about the time period, 1990, and I know that part of the history, I believe, of the creation of the organization was to deal with issues around violence on television and the issues around sex and portrayal of that. And so can I ask, in terms of the complaints, have you seen a change in the type of complaints you know, what Canadians are concerned about in terms of what's on television from say 1990, early 90s to now.
At least on one aspect of it, it's quite telling, and that is that from the time that Virginie Larivière presented her petition to Prime Minister Mulroney, when violence on television was a fairly significant concern, and when there were a lot of children's programs on television which contained violent elements, including Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, programs of that genre, there was more violence that was a concern. After the petition was presented and the broadcasters took an active position in revising the Violence Code of 1987 in order to, frankly, make it more effective and to focus more on children. And I find it interesting that one of the things noted in the in Bill C-327 is something that has been in existence since the 1st of January 1994, and that is very specific, and I suggest the most advanced provisions anywhere in the world for dealing with children's programming. This is only a partial answer to your question, but the point is that since that code has come into effect, the number of complaints relating to violence on television has actually decreased significantly. We noted in going back to 2001 a diminution of about 37% in the number of complaints that relate to violence on television. So I suggest that it's a diminishing problem in the television area, which is a very specific answer, I think, to what you're asking. It's become a really less important issue because it's so well dealt with, honestly, by the system that we have in place now. There are, I should say, though, to complete the answer, there are other issues which are rising a bit more. I think that the presence of sexual content on television, the presence of coarse language on television and radio are issues that are on the increase, unless Tisha, I don't know if you have any disagreement in that regard. Yeah. So those tend to be on the increase a bit. But again, one of the important protections that we have is that the watershed hour, which was originally created in that violence code to deal with violence intended exclusively for adults, we have expanded so that all forms of programming, including sexual content, including coarse language, including adult themes, these are all relegated to the post-watershed hour and must be accompanied by viewer advisories and so on. But there are increases in that.
Just one quick.
You'll have an opportunity in the next round. Mr. Cotto.
Good morning and welcome. I'm going to go back to the issue of violence on television. You're saying that we have a whole panoply of tools to deal with the subject of violence on television, and you specify that complaints in this area have been reduced by 37% between 2001 and 2006. At the same time, you reminded us that it's January 1st, 1994, that the whole strategy for dealing with the whole phenomenon of violence on television was ratified. So 37% is the complaints that have reduced or gone down, rather. Has the violence itself gone down? Have you measured that? No, we have not measured violence for any kind of content on television. We do not have the means to do so. And I do not know, I have not seen any study or survey or any research that indicates clearly what is happening on television. And I think we have to remember the fact that content that is violent is not necessarily problematic. The problem is the kind of violence that we see. In cartoons, for example, we can see violence that is not at all realistic, but it remains to be violence. Is it a problem? Not necessarily. It's very important to carry out studies on the nature of it that have been done by UCLA in California, for example, for the United States Congress. That was very specific and was analyzing the types of violence to be sure that we were talking about violence that is problematic. And I suggest to you that there's not necessarily any increase in problematic violence on Canadian television. That's one perspective, and it's very respectable. Others will say the contrary, but I must emphasize that Mr. Bigras' bill, which is C-327, is working against violence on television vis-a-vis the number of complaints on the issue. So I just wanted to make that point. Now, the bill does not deal with a reduction in complaints on violence. It wants to reduce the actual violence that is on TV, and it can be measured, for example, by reports that we see coming from Afghanistan, where children are still up and sitting in front of their television. So there are aspects of violence. We could eventually talk about the classification and the significance of it, but the research that we've seen today on video games, Xbox, Nintendo, those kinds of things, the new games are coming out every day. I'm sure if you listen to that, you'll find that there's quite a lot of talk about it. Children are not, who are not necessarily naturally violent, once they've been exposed to those games, become more violent. And it might not end up resulting in crimes, as we just saw this week in Virginia. But nevertheless, there are parents who have complained about this, and that was really at the origin of this bill. So I think that's not really the subject of today's debate. So I'll come back to the CBC SRC. Are you aware of the content on cultural diversity that was ratified by Canada and passed by UNESCO? Well, not in great detail, but diversity is a very important issue for us, indeed. Well, in that convention, it is mentioned that countries must promote diversity domestically and also internationally. So what does that inspire in you, for example, when you're talking about representativity in terms of the broadcasters, the presenters, all the models that we might see on television, and particularly for the public broadcaster, because that is what we are discussing? Well, our problem, of course, is primarily the public broadcaster vis-a-vis private broadcasters, and I understand that you are here to study the public broadcaster. So unfortunately, we only indeed represent private radio and television. Furthermore, I should add that we do not really have a mandate as far as diversity on television is concerned. What we are dealing with is a positive representation of diversity on the airwaves. The number of people of color, for example, who would appear on air or on boards. That's not really in our domain. We really are looking at the negative aspects, the way in which people are portrayed, and that is the important issue for us. I should say, if I may,
to the earlier comments of Monsieur Coteau. Monsieur Coteau, vous avez mentionné...
Mr. Coteau, you mentioned just a few minutes ago violent video games. but that is not in our area of jurisdiction, nor is it in the area of jurisdiction of the CBC. It doesn't come under the CRTC. Well, no, but I'm telling you that was not the goal of my question. I was asking about comparative research according to the categories of violence that may exist and to which children may be exposed. So we see these things on television. No, I understand you, but, well, and this was just in light of Bill C-327. Yes, well, in the case of violent video games, it gives you an indication of the means that are necessary or through which children would be exposed to violence, and it's up to the parents. The problem is that television should not at least be available to transmit that kind of violence, and if someone does it, it's usually through those kinds of violent video games. On the issue of complaints, you say that there's a difference between the complaints and the actual content. What is important, what's very important, is that the complaints represent really a kind of survey. It's a representation. Everyone is free to table the complaints that they want. Well, sometimes people give up, you know that. Well, nevertheless, it's an indication, and I'm just saying that it indicates to me that the level of the problem is decreasing in this region. Thank you.
Your presentation this morning, very interesting. I had said the other day at the hearings that I did find that we have, in terms of news reporting, in all private broadcasting, I think a very high standard, and when I watch it, I see, I think, a level of journalistic independence and impartiality. I am interested in this discussion of violence, because you had referred to Bill C-327, and I had spoken to Bill C-327. The example you'd given was the Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I have to confess, my daughters all went to see the movie the other night. They're big fans of the Ninja Turtles. They watched the Ninja Turtles all the time growing up. I never thought that them watching the Ninja Turtles would turn them into gangbangers. So when we talk about what kind of violence on television, I think there's issues of degrees, and so we take a stand on Ninja Turtles, and yet, as I use the example in Bill C-327, fear factor, watching it with my daughter, where the scenario was we have a little girl chained up, and she's covered in Moroccan hissing cockroaches, and the mother has to bite the cockroaches off with her mouth while the kid screams, and that's in prime time. But the fact is it's all A-okay, because at the end of the show, the mother, if she gets off enough cockroaches in time, wins, I don't know, a Mazda or a 10-speed bike or a plasma television or something. So child abuse for entertainment in prime time is okay, as long as the mother wins a prize at the end of it. Fear factor shows on Global, that's a Canadian network. What standards do you have for dealing with shows like that?
Well, first of all, that may, and no pun, believe me, is intended, Mr. Angus, but that may be a question of taste to a considerable extent. I couldn't imagine watching the circumstances that you just described yourself. But we have provision in our Broadcasting Act and regulations that deals with simultaneous substitution. And it may be that indeed fear factor comes in on a simultaneously substituted basis. I don't know the answer to that, but it may be that it does. If it does, it may come in at an earlier hour than it may otherwise come in if it were not benefiting, as it were, from simultaneous substitution. So I think it's a very important consideration. That issue is bigger than all of us in a way at this point, to know whether that arrives on that basis. Otherwise, you see, it would probably be post 9 o'clock with content that was inappropriate for pre-9 o'clock.
I guess my concern about simultaneous substitution, if it's something bigger than all of us, is it a factor that if it's U.S. programming, which seems to me increasingly predatory, and degrading. That as long as Canadian broadcasters are getting it on simultaneous substitution and putting our advertising on it, that there's very little we can do in order to say, hey, wait a minute, this just is not in our Canadian interest, because that leaves you to relegating the one or two shows that they do show that are Canadian, like Ben Mulrooney's Entertainment Tonight, which I don't think there's, or E-Talk, I don't think there's too much violence on that. So what role do you have in a world where we're getting shows in through simultaneous substitution?
Basically, there is a role that we have. We can indicate that something is problematic and draw conclusions, and we have done that on numerous occasions. But there is a protection in terms of content that might be described as violent content intended for adult audiences. There would be a permission, as it were, for a program to be broadcast prior to 9 o'clock. Otherwise, if it's broadcast by a Canadian private broadcaster, it is subject to all of our rules.
Okay. I don't want to put you on the spot by giving you examples, but I'm trying to find my way through how we would regulate this, because I think having your system in place is a very good system to have, and I support that. I'm thinking of the example of Kit Kat Blizzard ice cream from Dairy Queen. There's an advertisement out, I don't know if you're aware of it, where a boy is hanging on a hook while his brother taunts him and eats ice cream, and then a man comes in the room. And then the next scene we have the two boys hanging on hooks while the man taunts him and eats ice cream. Now that particular ad has very upset the family of Miles Newts, who was hung on a hook and taunted to death in the Windsor area just a few years ago. And the families tried to have that ad pulled. Apparently Dairy Queen said we won't run it in Windsor, but of course in an age of cable and satellite, that's not doing much. How does do you deal, first of all, do you deal with advertising? And secondly, how does the family take a complaint like that so they can actually get a very questionable ad like that off the air?
Advertising is dealt with by Advertising Standards Canada, and they can easily be found either through our website, where they are linked, or directly, of course, quite easily. Advertising Standards Canada, they're very good, very experienced, and they deal with most advertising issues in broadcast as well as print.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Fast.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for attending here, all four of you. I'd like to just take off on what Mr. Angus touched on a few minutes earlier. He referred to simultaneous substitution, where our Canadian broadcasters are essentially compelled contractually or otherwise to broadcast American programming in a time slot that they normally wouldn't broadcast in. Are you saying that effectively American programming can preempt our Canadian broadcast standards? And does the Broadcast Act actually allow that to happen?
No. What I'm saying is that there is, as it were, a buy in the best competitive sports sense for programming that may contain violence intended for adults, which comes in prior to the watershed hour of 9 o'clock. So there is a benefit that programming has from the point of view of the violence intended for adults issue only. It's subject to all other provisions in the Violence Code and in all of the other codes.
So what you're telling me is that the broadcasters actually make a contractual choice to allow American programming to preempt some of our standards in Canada?
No, I'm saying that only in the violence area can they benefit from any, if you wish to call it, an advantage with respect to the adult nature of the violence. Only that issue.
I understand.
And it comes in, something may come in, let's say, an hour earlier because it comes in that way from the States. The problem, and they're subject to all other provisions of all of our codes. The problem is that if the, and this was, I think, anticipated in the first place when those rules were created, that if programming is going to come in on the American channel an hour earlier, or 2 hours earlier, that people will watch that anyway, and there are no controls in place for programming that comes in on American channels, and the Canadian channel would, in a sense, lose whatever commercial benefits it might have coming in later in that evening. And it's only that issue. It's only the issue of being earlier.
I understand that, but by making it earlier, a greater number of Canadians are exposed to violence, when typically on a Canadian broadcaster they wouldn't be.
I suggest, yes, that might be the case. The question is, how much of that even occurs? Mr. Angus has raised an issue. I haven't seen that program. It's a general principle at the Broadcast Standards Council that we don't make judgments about a particular issue when an issue has not been weighed by all of the members of a panel sitting on it. So I'm giving Mr. Angus the benefit of the doubt. He's raised one example. I don't know if it would be found to be problematic in that regard. Can it occur? In theory, it can occur. Does it occur? Does it occur with any frequency? I would suggest to you that it likely doesn't occur with great frequency at all, that you have a program coming in earlier. Theoretically, it is undeniable that something could, but I suggest to you that the problem is not as great as a single example may suggest.
But if this became a problem, is that something your organization would consider reviewing?
We can't. Simultaneous substitution is not something that falls within our jurisdiction, it falls within the jurisdiction of the CRTC.
All right, thank you. A follow-up question. You also referred to viewer advisories as providing some level of protection so that parents can exercise some control over what their children watch. However, many families are under a lot of stress. We have working hours that are not as traditional as they used to be. We have families that are often under siege, and children who are often left unsupervised. We find that on the internet. I brought forward a bill that is hoping to toughen up sentences on those who use the internet to lure children. And often that happens in a context of a lack of supervision. Same would be true for television. Now, you've mentioned that the incidents of complaints regarding violence on television have gone down. Is that right?
That's right.
All right. In the area of sexual content, adult content that's probably not suitable for children, do you find the same kind of reduction in complaints, or is that an area that is still a bit of a struggle for your members?
It's an increase, probably. Well, I don't have a comparable statistic with me, but I've just checked with our Director of Policy, and I expect that area is probably, generally speaking, on an increase, has been over a period of time, with more adult sexual content, raising concerns for some Canadians than has previously been the case.
I think that's only true in the post-watershed.
Okay. Our Executive Director is making a very important point, that is probably only true in the post-watershed hour. So you have to appreciate the kind of balance that exists. And when you look at what's happening in the United States, where, in a sense, almost anything goes, with the exception of coarse language and a Janet Jackson type circumstance, otherwise violence and, let's say almost anything goes. In Canada, we don't have much of a problem, if any problem, with adult sexual content being on the air before 9 o'clock. So that's one very important issue. The other thing is that we balance in Canada the broadcaster's freedom of expression on the one hand with the information that they are prepared to provide and must provide to members of the public in order that members of the public can make informed choices about what they see. So, A, no adult content before 9 p.m. B, where there is adult content even after 9 p.m., the obligation of the broadcaster is to provide ratings icons, detailed viewer advisories in words, coming at the beginning of the show and coming out of every single commercial break, coding of the program so that the V-chip and other such devices can pick up and eliminate adult programming. So all these tools are provided in order that we balance freedom of expression on the one hand with the right of audiences to avoid programming that they don't want to see.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Fry?
I'm having a bit of a difficult time understanding some of your responses to the questions that Mr. Fast asked, and because you are only therefore acting in a reactive manner. Is that it? You are just reacting to complaints. You don't take any kind of proactive stance or position on ensuring that the violent content, and it's only violence you're obviously dealing with, is sort of that you actually have people who watch programs to ensure that the codes aren't, or the broadcaster's code isn't being violated, or that before you go to the CRTC that you may be able to be your own watchdog. So you're just being reactive. Is that my understanding?
Well, not only is it a correct understanding, I think it's very important that that be emphasized. We don't have censorship in Canada. The CRTC reacts to complaints, and the CBSC reacts to complaints. It is absolutely the case that we do not take the initiative to, as it were, vet programming before it's on the airwaves. We are absolutely reactive. We are proud of the fact that we are reactive because we don't assume that Canadians have a problem if not a single Canadian has a complaint to raise about a program. I think it's very, very important that the process works on that basis.
I understand that. Do you think there is a place for some sort of media watchdog in this country to look at whether or not there is the kind of programming that we want to be on the air? I mean, whether we wait only for people to complain or not, there needs to be some form of standard, some sort of ability for people to suggest that this is a kind of programming we would like to see, especially in the time when children are watching television. And I know there's a V-chip, and I know that there are all of those things in which parents can watchdog. The reality is that there's a great deal of violence on television. There's a great deal of violence against women. There's a great deal of stereotyping on television. And this is not just aimed at small children, but young people tend to watch that violence, and it does tend to reflect in the way that they behave. So I'm asking if you think there is a role here for some sort of media watchdog. I mean, I know that there are many of them, and they're purely NGOs on a voluntary basis. And I just have a little bit of a problem thinking that unless we get people complaining that everything is fine. So do you see a role for a watchdog body in Canada for the media?
A watchdog body that is not an NGO? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
No, not necessarily. I think that there is ample opportunity and freedom in this country to create bodies that deal with concerns of this nature. Media Watch was one such body for a good period of time, run for quite some time by Sherry Graydon, who was originally from your area of the country.
I know Sherry, yes.
As you know, and is now in Ottawa. My point is that Media Watch was such a body. Is there a place for bodies of that kind? Absolutely. I think it's a great free society where opportunities like that exist when there are problems. I don't begin with the assumption, as you appear to, that there is a problem with violence on television, quantities of violence on television. I don't begin with that assumption, and I don't know that there is any hard evidence of that whatsoever.
I disagree with you. There is hard evidence of that, but that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cotto.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cohen, in this panoply of tools that you mentioned earlier, saying that we have ways in which we can deal with violence on television, the means to do so, is there any legislation? Well, why? No, just tell me yes or no. I just want to know if in that panoply of tools there is legislation to which the public could turn. In the area of violence, well, you mentioned the idea that we have a whole panoply of tools with which to deal with violence on television. So, is there legislation? No. It does not include legislation. We have codes, etc., but no legislation. All right. Is that not the limiting aspect of such legislation that scares a certain number of people? We do not need legislation for theoretical reasons. We have to have a problem first. Well, in this regard, I agree with Ms. Fry. We don't agree on whether or not violence on television is theoretical. I think you have to recognize that with the number of complaints that we have received in our writing offices, because we receive those insults even at times, but I think the public wants legislation, and we have to be protected from those insults. The public could have the remedy of turning to the courts if there were legislation, if there has been what they consider to be some kind of attack on the youth in this country. Now, you talked about multiculturalism. So, just Mr. Cotto, may I, just before we move on, I might just add a little nuance, which is the following. The code dealing with violence is a condition of license for the broadcaster. And that, in effect, really is a statute. If you will, there is a legal protection for broadcasters that is based on the existence of that condition of license. It's a little nuance. All right, thank you. Coming back to your perspective of things, a decrease in the level of the number of complaints of 37% as regards violence on television from 2001 to 2006. Would the decrease not even be more marked if there were legislation that existed? Well, I don't think there'd be any change in that decrease. Why would that? An act wouldn't change that. No, but I think if this bill that we're talking about was passed, there would be a change. Well, that's a difference of perspective, and we don't share that opinion. That's right. This is a democracy. You were talking about multiculturalism earlier on, and I'd like to come back to that point. Do you think that the promotion of multiculturalism in broadcasting overall is a good thing or a bad thing? To bring people to a happier existence in this country and to share the same values? That's a simple question. I think that the diverse communities in Canada do not necessarily share the same values and traditions, and I think that in general the traditions of each of these communities has to be encouraged with certain exceptions. For example, if it's a question of public order. But in general, multiculturalism should really encourage the protection of the people and what you've said. Are you not afraid that television is an incredibly powerful tool that can affect the public psyche and can encourage certain behaviors? Are you not afraid that in the promotion of multiculturalism and on the audiovisual landscape, we are encouraging a kind of balkanization that will bring about what we've seen in England recently with different ethnic groups and the host country and culture? well, I'm not a sociologist, but I think that in Canada it's a good thing in general. The nature of multiculturalism as it is practiced in Canada is a good idea for society, and I do not see in that any balkanization of these communities. I think that up to a certain point there are traditions that we are respecting, but I think that there is a general approach that is very good. Not necessarily in the melting pot sense that we see in the United States, but with the Canadianization of our population here in this country. I think it very gently brings things to a positive end.
This has been a very productive day, and I thank you for your testimony, particularly with the debate on 327 coming up tomorrow. But I'd like to, if I may, just return briefly to the actual purpose of our hearing today, which was the full investigation of the role of the public broadcaster in the 21st century. And that is certainly not a criticism of your response to the questions. Your response has been very, very helpful. I guess my question would be, in your judgment, would it be of value for the CBC to join the other 690 stations and become a member of and not under the control of, but take some direction from the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council? I realize that this could be taken, your answer could be taken and construed as being self-serving, and I hope that readers of this transcript will not take it that way. I'm asking that question because it seems to me that if there are standards on public broadcasters, they have the eyes and ears of exactly the same people as would be watching the CBC, and it strikes me that we might be lacking some continuity here.
I think the question is a very good question. I don't know that it would be up to us in any way to advise the public broadcaster of what it should do, but I guess that what might be important, Mr. Abbott, is to look at this from the point of view of the Canadian people, of the population of this great country. There's necessarily some confusion when they don't know where to go, and when they don't know if there is a standard set of rules that applies across the country. It would seem to me, and that was one of the 2 points that I had hoped to make regarding the contribution that the CBSC makes, and that is that it would be less confusing and useful if the CBC were to follow rules and to have rules such as those that we apply, and would have an independent body to deal with them. At the moment, every decision that is taken by the CBSC is taken by a panel of no less than 50% members of the public. It may in some cases be slightly more. And it would seem to me that it would be very useful from a public perspective that the CBC would have an equivalent system in place, whether it was a part of our system or a system that it set up that was an equivalent, both as to content and as to procedure. I think that would be a useful thing.
That's really very helpful, because not infrequently we have complaints, or at least I certainly have in my office complaints, of people who feel that the CBC considers itself to be above their perspective, and you're suggesting that the idea of having at least 50% on a board or some kind of recognized organization to receive complaints about the CBC and their broadcasting standards is a good idea. However, I think it's pretty obvious that because you already have something in place for the CBC to duplicate it, would be an extra expense and really quite unnecessary. I take it that that's what that's the implication that I'm taking from what you're saying.
Well, I would prefer to leave you to take such an implication, if I may say. I can speak to, I think, the validity of the system and so on, and whether it should be we who undertake such an activity on behalf of another broadcaster, the public broadcaster, is not a decision for us to initiate.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just before we close, I always try to leave myself a little time for maybe a question. And one thing that you talk about was news. If there might be, some complaints of some news. The biggest complaint I've had is with some of our new specialty channels that have come in from, say, from China, and I think I don't know how those, how many questions you may receive or how many problems you may receive with that, but I've received quite a bit that some of these new channels that have come in are propaganda channels, and I don't know how you police that. Is there a way to police any of that?
There is. We use both the CAB Code of Ethics, in which Clause 5 deals with news, and Clause 6 deals with the full, fair, and proper presentation of news, opinion, comment, and editorial. We also use the Radio Television News Directors Association of Canada Code of Journalistic Ethics, all of which require balance, fairness, a number of other issues, mixing of news and editorial, for example. How do we deal with it? Assuming that the news services in question are Canadian licensees, they may well be members of ours, most stations are, and we would deal with it, with any such complaints under those codes without any difficulty. If, on the other hand, the undertakings fall on the list of basically of exempt broadcasters, the broadcasters that are foreign and remain foreign, then there is no way for us to deal with them any more than for the CRTC to deal with them. There's just no way to cope with services that are and remain foreign. It's only if that programming comes in on a Canadian licensee. You may remember the case of Al Jazeera that the CRTC was called upon to deal with. They set very special circumstances up in order for that particular service to be imported into Canada, but otherwise, if they are, as you say, let's say a Chinese service that's coming into Canada, all one could do would be to apply in due course to the CRTC to suggest that they aren't entitled to continue on the list of services.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your presentation this morning, your answers, and I thank everyone for the questions around the table. We'll recess for 5 minutes before our next witnesses. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to welcome our next witnesses from the Fédération Culturelle Canadienne Française. And we have Pierre Bourbeau, Director General, and Annick Schultz. So welcome this morning, and we'll welcome your brief, and then we'll take questions.
Merci. D'abord, je vais vous remercier.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to appear before you here today. And it's very important for us to be able to do so. You'll see through our presentation that the CBC SRC plays a very important role in the French Canadian identity. Now, I'd like to ask, first of all, the way in which I've organized my presentation. Is there limited time for in which I have to speak?
10 or 15 minutes. Yes.
Parfait, excellent. Fait que je vais peut-être me permettre.
Thank you. Well, perhaps, if I may, this is the first time that the FCCF appears before the Heritage Committee. I'll explain a little bit who we are, and then I'll move to the presentation of our brief. So the FCCF is a federation that has existed for 30 years now, and in 2007 we'll be celebrating our 30th anniversary. Our mandate is indeed to strengthen the arts and culture sector, but more comprehensively to develop Francophone communities in Canada. And as we were born really in the wake of the Official Languages Act, we work primarily outside of Quebec. So in order to fulfill our mandate, we have the support of some 20 members, 13 of which are provincial or territorial. That is to say that we have members across the country, from British Columbia and the Yukon to Newfoundland. So we have provincial and territorial organizations that work in the area of cultural and artistic development. We also have 7 national members who work in specific centers like visual arts, media arts, music, publishing, and theater. So in certain disciplines we have 2 members. For example, in media arts we have an association of Francophone producers in Canada, and if I am correct, they appeared before the committee in Winnipeg. We also have the FRIC, which is the Independent Producers or Directors Association for Canada. So in terms of music, we have the LIM, which is the National Music Industry Group, and we also have the National Songwriters Association. So that gives you an idea of our network. So with those 20 members, we think we reach out to some 250 regional and local organizations working in culture and artistic development. And through them, according to Hill Strategy statistics, some 3,200 Francophone artists outside of Quebec. Having said that, that is our federation, and I'll now move. In fact, you've received the summary of our brief, and I'm very pleased to hear that it was translated. So I'm going to go through that presentation to bring out the primary points. So in the preamble, we say that the primary goal of the Federation is, in submitting this brief to the committee, is to show that now more than ever Canada needs a strong, structured public network that will broadcast high-quality programming that reflects our cultural and linguistic identity. This is a societal choice that we must make together with pride and conviction. In the 21st century, and to this end, rather, Canada's public broadcaster must focus on fundamental principles which, although defined long before the proliferation of channels and the era of specialization, are still relevant today. Accessibility, diversity, and independence are still as important today as they were in the past. A fourth principle, one that is especially important when the public broadcaster must coexist with commercial broadcasters, has been added to these three: the principle of specificity. In our opinion, the management of Canada's public broadcaster must redefine these principles. These principles must be reinterpreted in a world that is now dominated by what many refer to as media fragmentation. For the sake of Canada's French-speaking community and for the sake of our artists, creators, and cultural players, the SRC-CBC must assume and continue to play a leading role in promoting Canada's Francophone identity. The SRC-CBC must be given the means and the framework to carry out this mandate. To ensure that it remains relevant and protect its raison d'être among Canadians, the SRC-CBC must become a truly Francophone, distinct and unifying media space that is accessible to everyone. It must become a citizens' forum, a place for open dialogue and free speech, a space that reflects a sense of identity and belonging. It must ensure that the continued existence of Canada's linguistic, cultural, and social networks, while at the same time maintaining a balanced representation of the various components of our society. In closing, we believe that we must bring together and obtain the support of all the players in our civil society to prove the pertinence of a new concept of public broadcasting in Canada and ensure its ongoing existence amid the new paradigms that are emerging. The public mandate of the CBC, and I'm sorry, I'm going to add a little, if I may, because I presented a bit of the mandate, but we're talking primarily about CBC, and our presentation really is dealing with the Francophone side, the SRC. So with the 28 services that are offered on various platforms like radio, television, internet, and satellite radio, as well as digital, not including all of the wireless, SMS, and music services that CBC Radio-Canada offers, it really is a national institution, or they present themselves as such. But having said that, the question that we have is that in reality, and more specifically for the Francophone cultural and artistic communities, is the SRC truly fulfilling its responsibilities for each of the components of its mandate? And at the outset, I'll say that we greatly appreciate the cooperation that exists between the Francophone population in Canada and the SRC, but we firmly believe that they must be given more resources to be able to fulfill its mandate in the eyes of the Francophone of this country. In terms of accessibility, as a public broadcaster, the SRC must be accessible across the country. This is an egalitarian a principle that should be respected. All of our citizens must be on a level playing field regardless of their income. It would be important for the CRTC to deal with this issue and to speak to the broadcasters and satellite providers in order that Canadian Francophones have an equal access. The strike in 2006 at the CBC-SRC highlighted the weaknesses of the distribution network and the fragility of the accessibility to Francophone services for a very significant number of Francophones in this country. And in that regard, the inconsistencies that we have in a province like Ontario, for example, where certain Francophones only have access to the Montreal signal of SRC, or people in the West who only get Alberta news, has to be dealt with. In terms of content, it should be popular, not in a pejorative sense. The citizens' forum that SRC constitutes should not always be reserved to the same group of insiders. In our world, we say that SRC should not be Radio Montréal. It really should be Radio Canada. The SRC must, in the end, try to reach out to all of its public through all of its shows and through its diversity. Faced with the programming of the public service, the public has to recognize what distinguishes it from others. So without excluding from others, they should create new niche markets and new genres, and it has played a very important role in forging new programming on its network. In fact, in the end, if the SRC is a forum in which people can freely express their opinions, as well as those who are critical of it, its freedom must absolutely be free of political interference. The SRC has to do things differently, and this would allow citizens to be informed on a variety of subjects and to acquire knowledge, always in the context of programming that is interesting and attractive. But SRC should not limit its programming to cultural and educational programming. In terms of governance, one of the aspects that it greatly interests our association, and this doesn't deal only with CBC but SRC, but all cultural agencies, it's that Francophones should be better represented on boards. Currently, there is no one representing the Canadian Francophonie on the CBC board. That is to say, the Francophones outside of Quebec. This has to be corrected, and we have to find a way to do so. Not on a one-time basis, but on a permanent basis. In terms of the funding difficulties, what we want to set out in this brief is that we believe that the budget cutbacks that the SRC-CBC has suffered has obliged it to play a role that looks more and more like TVA, TQS, and the other private networks. We believe that if we truly want to have a public broadcaster, it has to be given the means to play the role of the public broadcaster and to present programming that is specific and that differentiates it from the private networks, and indeed to allow it to get out of the game of worrying about ratings all the time. And it has had to do that because it is more and more dependent on advertising revenues, and it is obliged, therefore, to have a higher and higher audience rating. So in order to provide increased funding to the CBC, we are suggesting certain ideas. Obviously, there'll be discussion on the point, but we have to find a way to really keep the interest of the public. And what we have tried to show is that the various studies that have been done, one in 2005 concerning the 10 countries Canada is the 7th country on the scale of its investments in its public broadcaster compared with other countries like Germany, Sweden, and Norway, if memory serves me well. Those countries found different ways of ensuring that they would have a strong public broadcaster, and I think that we should be inspired by those models. In some cases, there's a juxtaposition, a combination of public funding as well as a royalty system, and so this is a debate that we really could have here, but always with a goal to having a public broadcaster that reflects the specificity of this country. And to that end, I would like to advocate, and unfortunately I don't have the documents before me here, but I'd like to speak about a study that said that Radio-Canada could be a very strong tool in developing Canadian identity. It was at the end of the 60s, early 70s that CBC decided, or SRC decided through the Téléjournal to really build a Quebec identity, and it's been proven that the fact that the SRC launched this project is that SRC became a real promoter of Québécois society. So if that is true, what we are suggesting is that the SRC should become a strategic tool to develop a very strong Franco-Canadian identity, which will reflect that community's specificities, its regional diversity, its multiculturalism, which is becoming a stronger and stronger force for these communities. But as I say, they need to be given the means to reflect that image back to the people. So thank you. That's took probably about 10 minutes, and I'll wrap up my presentation there. Thanks.
That's pretty good, dear.
Thanks. I'm sweating.
Just to 5 minutes. Maybe we can get more questions and answers in. Mr. Scott, you're first, please.
I won't take that personally. Bienvenue pour la première fois.
Welcome. You're coming for the first time? Well, I'm the Director General, and I have been for 3 years. And it's possible that in the past the Federation was able to appear before the Heritage Committee. I think we've appeared before official languages, but it's our first time here as far as I know.
And you have spoken to the fact that's what you've presented here. I think that you can be very helpful to us because I think we have common cause. I know how important Radio-Canada and other Francophone expressions have been across the country. Je viens de Nouveau-Brunswick.
I come from New Brunswick, and that's very important there.
That your experience in recognizing how important it is in the context of minorities within Canada and various parts of the country is an experience that as Canadians in the continent overwhelmed in the same way with American cultural and values expression that Francophones, Acadiens, and New Brunswick would have the same experience, being overwhelmed with Anglophone influence, and it's a very difficult balance to find. So you were here for the last witnesses, and to some extent I'm struggling with an instinct to try and isolate ourselves by restricting what's incoming, and I don't know that the level of possibility of restricting it. I got 2 kids, 20 and 22, whose world is just a completely different world than mine in the context of inputs. I don't know if it's just trying to bail out the boat with a teaspoon. And the reality is maybe what we really have to do, and I think that's been the experience, to use your experience as an analogy for ours, I think that's been the experience. It's not been that we're resisting as much as we're building alternatives, opportunities. And because we have new technology, perhaps we can embrace that new technology to build alternatives, which is not to say that I find some of the stuff that I see any more deplorable than Mr. Angus in terms of this programming. I just don't know that what we really need to focus on, in addition to restrictions, as much as you can restrict it, is good, solid alternatives so that Canadians can see expression. I mean, the former witnesses talked about Canadian values in the context of all the lists that they presented in their presentation. But the reality is that isn't just a matter of sort of measuring what's coming at us in the context of those things, but offering alternative content that contains those values. Am I on the right track in this? Maybe that's the best way to ask.
Regardez, ma réaction par rapport à ça, je dirais...
Well, my reaction to that is that clearly, if we use the word protectionism, there can be a negative connotation to that word. I believe that what we have to do as a Canadian society is, above all, first and foremost, and this is part of the evolution of the whole concept of cultural diversity in the convention that's been ratified here, we have to recognize that on a global scale, every country must have the means to create artistic and cultural products that reflect its specificities. And they have to have the means to protect it as well, because if this is done globally, yes, some societies are stronger than others, and you have to recognize that those bigger forces have the effect of homogenizing the other smaller players. So I call it positive discrimination. We have to make choices based on the values of our country. So at that point I say the base has to be established, the foundation has to be created in terms of regulation, and some will call that discrimination, but I call it this positive discrimination, and it's with the goal of protecting that diversity. And from that point on, we could open ourselves up more to the world so that our own people are aware of what's happening elsewhere. So I think these regulations have to be based on values. And for me, the Broadcasting Act is very eloquent on this point already. So on that basis already we can do that. Now that's my personal opinion. We're very open to the United States now. We don't need to be more so in that regard. I think we should be more open to the rest of the world other than the United States, but by protecting also what we are and who we are. And in doing so, we have certain challenges. Now, CBC, Radio-Canada, has been obliged to play a much more commercial role than a public broadcaster should, and what I say is that the CBC, SRC more specifically, is too concentrated on Montreal. It should be more open to all of the francophonie of Canada.
Resources, and I think we agree on that point. The success of the Renaissance among Acadians in my part of the country over the last 30, 40 years, a lot of it has to do with duality, education system, and so on. I'd like you to respond to questions about crossover, Radio-Canada, CBC. Where does it become unhealthy to do that kind of crossover, or have we matured beyond that?
Vous voulez dire défavoriser une meilleure collaboration entre CBC?
You mean encouraging more cooperation between CBC and SRC? That's what you mean by crossover? All right. Well, what I would say that it's absolutely to the advantage of the CBC to do so, because I worked for 4 years, or lived 4 years in Alberta and also in the Yukon, and in those areas I saw an excellent cooperation between the SRC and the CBC. And in the north, at one point I was the director of the Francophone Association of the Yukon, and at one point we were fighting hard to have a journalist who was bilingual who could serve both communities, and in that way we decided to create really winning conditions for everyone. Also, when I lived in Alberta, when Mr. Denis was there was a great deal of cooperation between both sides in terms of sharing film, etc. So in my opinion, absolutely, that's a great idea.
Bourgeois.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to our witnesses. Now, in your brief, you say that the SRC has really played a very significant role, a very important role in the development of a Canadian identity. So how did it take on this role? And could you explain that? Well, there's our regional services that would be at the basis of this. So it would really be through these regional services, I would say. And clearly when we look at what's happening province by province and in the various regions, what happens in the Atlantic or in Ontario, it's very difficult to really identify the trends. But I think that what we hear from the Francophone and Acadian communities is that they are really generally satisfied with the work that SRC is doing. But they see and hear themselves on the radio, if less so on television. And I think that the work that SRC does on the radio is greatly appreciated. It's a medium that doesn't cost very much, and the morning, noon, and afternoon shows are shows that really promote the local color, if you will. And I think that as far as television is concerned, I hear there are problems. Yes, we only have a half an hour per day, perhaps, with the local newscast, and we might, in the arts and culture, only see 2 minutes of content for us. So there is some dissatisfaction with certain communities. It's a beginning, but it's not enough. And why is it not enough? Well, or why can't they do more? It's because it costs a great deal to maintain all of that regional infrastructure. And once again, it's an issue of values. If we want to have this regional representativity, and if people want to see themselves on television, you have to give them the means to be able to do so. In some cases, for example, in the Atlantic, what I hear is that, yes, the idea of having a show like Brio is wonderful, but it's a show that doesn't have the means to really fulfill its mandate. So it's in that sense that I'm saying that, yes, there is a foundation, and it's a good one, but what we must do is to take that and build on it. Now, I'm just talking about the regional level, if I can just wrap up. Where it's weak is on the national scale. And I repeat that we all see Radio-Canada nationally as being Radio Montréal. It has to break out of that mold so that we have we don't have the impression that all of the best of the arts and culture is concentrated in Montreal alone. It has to open itself up to the rest of the country. Well, I don't want to be unkind, but we've traveled as a committee. We've been to Yellowknife and Vancouver. And with few exceptions, the Francophone groups said that they were disappointed. They do not want to denounce the SRC and CBC for the services they receive, but they all said that they were disappointed with local and regional coverage as it was being offered by SRC in their communities. And on top of that, in Yellowknife, there's even an antenna that belongs to a Francophone group, and it's through that antenna that the SRC is being broadcast without giving them a penny. So that brings me to ask you, sir, because you say that CBC, SRC has to be given the means, the resources, and so you're saying that they should have to drop the ad revenue that they have now. In your opinion, is there any alternative to this income shortfall, this funding shortfall, if they drop the ad revenue? Well, that's why we mentioned in our text the idea of royalties, such as exists in France. It's a kind of tax, and by household in France, it's like 500 francs or 1,200 euros per year. And the goal of it is to finance public broadcasting. In other countries, it's a royalty system, and we're suggesting that as a possible solution, because clearly, as soon as we start talking about additional taxes, the reaction is usually quite negative. But in our opinion, this is fundamental and really necessary to keep a public broadcaster. On the other hand, Canadian Francophones and all Canadians already pay a certain amount through their taxes, their current taxes, to maintain this Crown corporation that is CBC SRC. So you want to add another tax to that? Well, that's a possible solution in the sense that if it was done in that way, what you would be really looking for would be for people to sign on to that, but more, in that sense, also, CBC SRC would be more accountable to the public. Well, I don't have much time, but perhaps I'll be able to come back afterwards. You wanted to talk about governance, or I wanted to talk rather about governance, if I will, later. I wanted to thank you for your presentation today. Last week, we had a meeting with the Franco-Manitoban organizations, and I think that next week we will be meeting with ACFO from Timmins. So the message really is very similar to yours. We have heard that the SRC has been a strong promoter of Quebec culture, but not so much for Francophones in other areas of Canada. Do you have a recommendation, a concrete one, as to how that situation may be improved? Well, yes, indeed. I think it was in June of last year, we launched a process that's been over a year ago, where we met the authorities from the CRTC, I almost said the CBC, but to see what they could do for us with under sections 41, 42, and 43 of the Official Languages Act. And one of the recommendations, indeed, was that there be a position that is dedicated specifically under section 42 for this kind of service. And what the CRTC told us that they had 10 other issues that they were dealing with in terms of the Canadian francophonie, and these files were being worked on by several different people. So we were recommending that under 41 and 42 they create a specific position to coordinate all of this work and to be a sort of ombudsman between the CRTC and the Canadian francophonie. So it was a while ago, and I haven't seen a written report on the subject, so I'm a little taken off guard with that this morning. I can't tell you exactly where they're at with that. But it seems to me that the position was indeed specifically created following this, and I think that the scope of it is still being determined. In my region in Northern Ontario, Francophone culture is very present. There are many organizations that support the development of it. There are a great many artists and festivals and schools. There's a public or community radio station. There's organization like ACFO, but there's a lack of resources to support television there. And this is a big problem in my riding and in my region, and the role of Francophone television is extremely limited. I think also there is a lack of capacity to create production in that region. So do you have any recommendations as to what we could do to change that situation and support the development of Francophone programs in the north and in the west? Well, as far as that is concerned, what we say is that, as the FTCQ said, the Canadian Television Fund should be added to, and with the APFC, we, as you know, with the CTF, there is 200 million that's given to English productions, 100 to French, and in the 100 million that's dedicated to Francophone productions, there's an agreement between Canadian Heritage and the fund. 10% has to go to Franco-Canadian productions. So in our opinion, that's a start, but that percentage should be higher. It should be at least 15%. And we took that figure because when there is a national budget dedicated to the francophonie, the Canadian francophonie represents 15% of the pool of francophones in this country. So out of that national budget, 15% should be earmarked for the Canadian francophonie. So changes in those percentages, moving that percentage from 10 to 15 in terms of Franco-Canadian production. And I think Louis Paquin in Winnipeg already probably well expressed the limits that 10% imposes on producers currently. It limits Franco-Canadians in their capacity to do co-productions. Co-production becomes a way of multiplying the number of productions that you can participate in. Instead of having a single source of funding, you'd have several sources of funding. Thank you.
Chair, I'd like to go back to something that Madame Bourgeois raised earlier, and that is the whole issue of funding. And one of the suggestions that you made was that in order to provide additional funding to CBC, perhaps we could use royalties to do that, which is essentially just more taxation, government money to do that. There are other funding models that could be used. Earlier, we heard witnesses who have suggested that private broadcasters should no longer receive any public money. However, the trade-off would be that the private broadcasters would receive the benefit of relaxed Canadian content regulations. One of the suggestions that has also been made is that there is a role for private broadcasters in strengthening CBC, in fact, in ensuring that there's a robust public broadcaster in Canada. First of all, are you supportive of additional creative ways of finding funding to ensure CBC has a long-term future? And secondly, your comments on some of the proposals other witnesses have made as to getting the private broadcasters out of the public funding business and also perhaps contributing to a public broadcaster.
Bon, je vais essayer de répondre en deux temps à votre question. La première, c'est que, effectivement...
Well, as to your first question, the basic principle we're setting out is that a public company like CBC or SRC should receive more public funding, so if it is to be able to play its role. And we see that if that is to be the case, we'll see a television that will have far less need to go and out and look for ad revenues. They won't need to find that kind of private ad revenue, and the private broadcasters will be able to take all of that advertising revenue for themselves. Then the public broadcaster would also be able to develop the kind of programming we're looking for. So that is the logic in terms of funding that we look at. Now, as to the means that we have, is it an issue of going to see what else is available in other countries and doing a mix of the two? That's the discussion we have to have. But we need to have a public broadcaster that is better equipped. And what I would say is that in terms of promoting Canadian content, I would say that it's also it's a very good idea for the private broadcasters to still have access to a fund like the CTF. It allows them to broaden their own Canadian content, and I think it's very good that they continue to have access to that fund. Yes.
Be given to private broadcasters to ensure that there's ongoing Canadian content.
Avec les outils qu'on a présentement, oui. Fonds canadien de la télévision.
Well, with the tools we currently have, yes. I think that the CTF is very good, and it's fine that the private broadcasters be able to have access to that fund to create Canadian content.
Just one other question. You'd mentioned that, and I think I'm quoting you correctly, SRC should not be Radio Montreal. And that's something we've heard not only in Yellowknife and Vancouver, but also in Winnipeg. that francophonies around Canada are saying, listen, we don't want to simply see the face of Quebec. We want to see our face as being francophones in the rest of the country. Do you have any suggestions on how to better achieve that, aside from the additional funding that we've just talked about?
OK. Bon, les recommandations par rapport à ça, mais moi, je vous dirais...
Well, my recommendations in that regard, and I would say once again that over the last 10 years, we would say that Canadian producers, directors, actors are people who have really seen a level of of becoming more professional that's been impressive, but it's not well known at the same time. So I think that for all kinds of reasons, I could probably write another whole brief on that, I would say that pool of professionals is very little known by the people who are working for Radio-Canada based in Montreal. So we know them through other artistic and cultural networks. Often they're the people who work for SRC come from Montreal. So when they are looking for researchers, doing research rather, and looking for people, they go to the pools that they are aware of. So we need to have those people, get those people better known across the country. And that is why we're saying in shows like Tout le monde en parle and Bombardier en France, those are shows that are good examples. There's no good reason why the Canadian francophonie should not be highlighted on those programs. And that's why we're saying that the regional aspects are not reflected at the national level, and the SRC has the responsibility of showing this diverse and multicultural Canadian francophonie. So they're working on it, but they need to be better aware of the resources that exist. And I think that that Francophone community outside of Quebec can work with the SRC, as the SRC already has an infrastructure that exists across the country, and they could require more cooperation from the SRC in Montreal and its regional stations.
I'm allowing Ms. Keeper to have a very short question, a very short answer, because I have 2 minutes.
Okay. You mentioned Mr. Paquin, and I heard his presentation, and I know his work. And he had talked about the increased funding through the CTF being critical to ensuring that regional voice, those types of programming could be created. And that's part of what the Broadcasting Act stipulates, is that we should encourage a pool of professionals. Can you just talk about the type of partnerships that you see maybe your organization would be able to work with CBC, or are there partnerships within the Francophone community that CBC should be participating in to fulfill its mandate?
Présentement, je vous dirais,
Currently, I would say that in that regard, there is an agreement between arts and cultural groups. It was signed between 7 agencies and the federal government, as well as the Fédération Canadienne-Française. So the agreement was aimed at making sure that it was not just Canadian Heritage that was involved in this kind of development, but other agencies as well. CBC is a signatory as well. And because of that, we have bilateral relations between our association and Radio-Canada. We see each other once a year currently, but we'd like to see that those communications increase. We'd like to be able to talk more about how we can achieve our objectives, that the Canadian francophonie be more visible, particularly on the national airwaves. So I think that there is great sensitivity to this, and there is a great deal of openness, but once again, we feel that the major obstacle is the whole issue of ratings. And because of that, there's this perception that Quebecers or Montrealers should be presented with content that they would be interested in seeing. And very often there's this fear of going further afield and seeing what's happening elsewhere. Because I was saying earlier that people in Radio-Canada are people generally from Montreal, and so I think that there are currently key players who are on the scene now who are from the Canadian francophonie, and we are starting to see a direct effect of that. I'd also say that the SRC's strategy to integrate radio, television, and internet has had very beneficial effects and can have very beneficial effects for Canadian francophonie.
I thank you for your presentation this morning and your answers to the various questions. Meeting adjourned.